Good morning. We are thrilled to have you with us virtually today at the NC Chambers Energy Summit. It is my pleasure to introduce George Baldwin, consultant with the NC Chamber and principal of Baldwin Consulting Group, or BCG, which he established in 2017 and operates at the nexus of energy, environmental, and regulatory matters. Prior to managing BCG, George served as Duke Energy's Director of Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and Natural Gas Policy, and as a Managing Director of Government Relations and Sustainability for Piedmont Natural Gas. He is also a recipient of the Order of the Longleaf Pine, the highest civilian honor in North Carolina. George, the stage is yours.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Janelle, for the warm welcome. On behalf of the North Carolina Chamber, thank you all in our audience for your interest and commitment to today's discussions on a topic that is crucial to North Carolina's future. I'd like to first recognize and thank our sponsors for their support, in particular, our presenting sponsor, Duke Energy. Today's silver sponsors are ABB and MVP Southgate, bronze sponsors, APCO Worldwide, Dominion Energy, North Carolina's electric cooperatives, Pike Electric, Schweitzer Engineering Laboratories, and Smith Anderson. All sponsors, including our patrons, can be found throughout today's presentation, and I hope you'll take note of them in the sponsor section of the event platform, as they've played a vital role in making this summit possible. A few reminders for our morning together. Today's program can be found in the lobby section under the agenda tab in the left sidebar and at the bottom of this main stage where all of our sessions will take place live. We encourage you to update your personal profile information in the people section if you haven't had a chance to do so, so that you can begin connecting with fellow attendees one-on-one to maximize your networking. The lounge area is accessible throughout the event as well as during allocated networking breaks and at the end of the program. We hope you'll visit the lounge for real-time group conversations. For those of you who would like to follow along with today's event on Twitter, we'll be using the hashtag NCEnergy. And finally, we'll be sending out an email recap, including the event recording and additional resources shared today. So let's set the backdrop for today's program. The events of the past year have accelerated the pace of change and raised new issues and questions within virtually every major area of public policy. Energy is no different. In February of this year, a deadly winter storm hit Texas, contributing to a massive energy generation failure, cutting power to millions of people during one of the coldest stretches the state had seen in decades. Insiders there tested that the state came alarmingly close to suffering a catastrophic collapse of its grid. As it happened, those disruptions did lead to critical shortages of water, food, and heat for many Texans, along with exorbitantly high energy bills. And tragically, they also resulted in health problems and loss of life brought on by factors as wide-ranging as hypothermia and carbon monoxide poisoning. Understandably, this event and the tragic stories associated with it place the issue of energy reliability at the forefront of policy conversations nationwide. Here in North Carolina, we are fortunate to enjoy access to a robust energy network powered by a diverse portfolio of generation options with a long history of competent operation. We're also fortunate that many in North Carolina have taken a collaborative approach to supporting this essential asset. From the providers of energy to the regulators to the job creators, all have worked together to drive our state's growth. Still, in today's fast-changing energy landscape, we must always be thinking a few steps ahead to ensure our state can navigate the challenges and opportunities tomorrow will bring. That's what today's event is all about, bringing North Carolina's energy stakeholders together to ask future-focused questions and begin developing the answers we will need to guide the path forward. This year's Energy Summit offers a revamped agenda with discussions focused squarely on topics at the heart of these essential questions. Before we get started with today's program, please join me in watching this brief video from our presenting sponsor, Duke Energy.
We all want to support our community and small businesses, protect the environment and our kids' future, and above all, help others when they need it. That's why every day our energy goes into delivering reliable, cleaner, affordable energy. The energy that promises a better tomorrow with new jobs and opportunities and helps everyone move forward together. We're Duke Energy, and we're building a smarter energy future for you.
Thank you to Duke Energy for partnering with leaders statewide to power an energy future for North Carolina. So now let's get started with our program. It's my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Rachel Jones, Vice President of Energy and Resources Policy at the National Association of Manufacturers. Rachel Jones oversees their energy and environmental policy work and has expertise in issues ranging from energy production and use to air and water quality, climate change, energy efficiency, and environmental regulation. Before joining NAM, she was the Environment and Energy Counsel for the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Science, Space, and Technology, where she advised the committees on EPA, Department of Energy, Department of Interior, FERC, NASA, NOAA, and the White House Office of Science and Technology Activities. Please join me in welcoming Rachel to the virtual stage, and don't hesitate to submit questions to her by clicking the Q&A icon in the top menu of the chat area. Rachel, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, George. I'm really, really glad to be with everyone here this Tuesday morning. I loved a lot of what you said about sort of not just sort of tracking what's going on, but navigating sort of how we can be a part of the future and leaning in. That is really something that's top of mind to me and our member companies across all sectors. So excited to be a part of this conversation here today. As I was thinking about this and thinking about sort of how do we navigate all the things that are changing around us, I want to tell you about three people: Kitty, Dave, and Lisa. And really what they have taught me, and I think can teach us about energy and environmental issues. I'll start by saying my comms folks had pulled together some really great remarks for me, the kind that talk about all of the really fantastic things that the NAM is doing and how we're leading, and that goes through full policy and political landscape. And those are important things. And I'm hopeful that we can have time for some good Q&A and we can focus on the issues specifically that matter most to you. But first, I really want to tell you about the three people that I think I learned the most from this year and are really helping me as we try to navigate this complicated policy and political landscape. So Kitty comes first. She reminds me to stay calm in the face of change. So if you were to meet Kitty, you'd immediately notice that she has bright blue eyes. She makes the best potato salad that you've ever tasted in your life. Kitty was born in 1925. Calvin Coolidge was president at the time. Her daddy was a wallpaper hanger. And at close to a century now, she's still working harder than any person I know. Kitty's my grandmother, and she's also my best friend. But to think a little bit more about Kitty, Kitty's a big fan of Donald Trump, and she prays for Melania almost every single morning. She reads the paper, and she asks me about Bernie and AOC and what's going on. And you can tell that it's not really the direction that she personally is interested in. But, as she follows politics closer than most people in my family, she isn't upset. And that's the big lesson that Kitty has taught me as we're facing these things, is that the one constant is change. And so we might as well stay calm and look at the work ahead and figure out how we can be a part of the future and a part of solutions. One of my favorite things that she said to me a couple different times is she's got such a great Southern accent, and she says, I've seen a lot of men live in that big white house, and it didn't matter if they were Republican or Democrat. My grass kept growing. And the funny thing is, I better get on and get the job done and not just worry about who's in that big white house. And I think, she said that to me over the years, and to see the wisdom of someone who's gone from no electricity in their home to the point of, we're having multiple countries that are exploring space. That idea of not being afraid of change, and staying calm in the face of things that maybe you don't fully agree with, that's been a huge lesson. The second person that I've really learned a lot from this year is Dave. Dave shows us the power of sharing your own story. Uh, Dave isn't a political guy. He's a businessman. He's the owner and CEO of a medium-sized manufacturing company. And I met him about a year ago. And like so many people that we've met lately, I've never met him in person. I couldn't identify him in a lineup or know if I ran into him on the street. But remember that essential business scramble that we were all in the middle of this time last spring? Well, I found myself unexpectedly leading that work for the NAM. And he was trying to keep 3 facilities open, that represented about 400 jobs for people across several different states. And, his employees, their families, the surrounding communities that they all supported, they will probably never know how he worked around the clock to keep them safe, to keep opportunity alive. But it didn't mean that what he was doing wasn't important or wasn't a tremendous challenge. Dave had come to me a day or two into the shutdowns, and at the time, he'd never contacted policymakers before. He didn't know how to reach his state government, let alone anyone at the federal level. There were too many people like Dave at the time, for us to take on all of that work for each individual manufacturer and company across different industrial sectors. So instead, we helped them navigate the process, and he started making cold calls. He took matters into his own hands and he spoke out. For the first time, he shared the story of what his workers were doing, what he was doing to keep them safe, and how critical the things that they were making, while they might not look like the end products, they were the components that went into everything from hospital beds to ventilators to specialty coatings that were needed, to keep hospitals up to sanitary standards. Dave said that it was hard at first, but he realized that he had been counting on supply chains, counting on predictability, counting on others to advocate for him. And he realized that the most powerful tool that he had, the one that actually kept his facilities open, was his own story and his willingness to share that and to find people that would listen. It literally opened doors for Dave and for the hundreds of families that were counting on those paychecks and that stability in a time of change and uncertainty. The third person, that I want to mention today is Lisa. Lisa reminds me to connect as people. I don't actually know Lisa. We met a couple of weeks ago when she gave me my first shot of the Moderna vaccine. And over the last year, I think a lot of us would admit that we've become somewhat disconnected in many ways. We've often been fighting for survival, for sanity, for some glimmer of a return to normalcy. And, when Lisa gave me my shot, I saw that glimmer, that light at the end of the tunnel. And then in the 15 minutes that, they have you sit there after your shot to watch you and make sure that there aren't any reactions, she didn't have any other folks coming through. And so we kind of visited. She and I traded stories of how our lives have changed in the last year, of the small roles that each of us have played, whether it's in supply chains and keeping them up and going, or finding new ones, making connections, keeping things moving, in providing for family and neighbors. We really connected as humans. And Lisa is someone who works with her hands. She's one of the millions of Americans who've worked quietly and diligently behind the scenes. In a time of tremendous change and challenge, she didn't quit, she leaned in. And I owe her and you a debt of gratitude. Many of the most important acts will go unnoticed, unreported, but that doesn't make them unimportant. And that 15 minutes of connecting with Lisa in the candy aisle of a CVS really reminded me that if we connect as humans, we have the power to do so much more than if we simply connect with numbers or jobs. When we put names and faces to the important roles that so many Americans have played, it adds a tremendous amount of power to what those particular stories can do. So, you're probably asking at this point, so, okay, what do Kitty, Dave, and Lisa really have to do with energy policy and effective advocacy? And I would really say that the three of them and what I've learned from each of them really translates into, as we're looking at energy transitions, how we should approach it if we want to come out successfully. The first from Kitty, calm. Leaning into the work that's before us. The one thing that's constant is change. And so instead of getting too wrapped around the axle about the fact that we're faced with changes and challenges, lean in, stay calm, and work on it. The second, from Dave, which is speak out and tell your story. In a virtual world, it's actually easier than ever for people from all over the country to be engaging, to be telling their story, to be a part of the conversation. I know it's hard, it can be uncomfortable, but the first step is just doing it. The third thing that I think Lisa really teaches me is the importance of remembering to connect on the human level. If you're a numbers person, as so many business people are, you often want numbers when you're trying to advocate on something or when you're trying to evaluate policies. But there is a reason that people are drawn to stories. We connect as people, not as numbers. And so keeping these three things in mind as we're thinking about advocacy in the energy and environmental space, I think are really keys to our success here. If I had a crystal ball and I was to say, hey, what are the biggest issues that you see moving, Rachel, and what do they look like? I generally tell people I see sort of three buckets of issues. One is climate and energy transition. That's a really big one. You're going to hear a lot more about that today from a lot of different points of view, all of them really critical and important. There's no one silver bullet here, as I think all of us know, but it's going to really require leaning in on lots of different options and figuring out how we can continue to improve on them. And there's going to be some that none of us have even thought of yet. The next bucket that I really think of is what I call the other PPP. And that's chemical issues. And so the PPP that I think of in the chemical space is PIP. PIP 3-to-1, some of you guys may have worked on. It's a regulation that came out of EPA that would ban a specific chemical. And we're all kind of scrambling against a deadline there. But I think it is something, it's illustrative of some of the challenges that we're going to see coming at the federal level, in particular under the new TSCA and a lot of additional chemical regulatory authority that EPA is beginning to exercise. The second of the PPP is PFAS. And you guys in North Carolina are very, I think, familiar with a lot of this. This issue is not disappearing, but I think the good news is industry and communities and advocacy groups are all leaning in towards a more solutions focused approach. And if we're willing to do that, I think that we can really provide certainty for communities on a much shorter timeline. But that's going to be a big, tricky issue to sort out, and it's not going to be done overnight. And then the third of the PPP is plastics. So plastics issues are only growing. It's not just about single-use plastics or plastics, plastic bag bans or people getting rid of straws. It's much bigger. The US and the world is already considering negotiating an international marine litter and plastic waste treaty that could have really major impacts on every link in the plastic supply chain. And it's not just those who produce plastics. Almost all of us are a part of the downstream user community. And whether that's plastics or whether that's any of these other chemicals that I talked about, this space is also really growing. The third bucket, I would say, is onshoring and environmental justice. We're continuing to see a real push towards bringing more manufacturing and links of supply chains back. And we're also seeing a continued focus at the national level on environmental justice and how we can make sure that no community is left behind. So these three, climate, PPP, and sort of the onshoring buckets, are really the biggest ones that we see moving this year and into next year. The one thing that I will call out as the very common thread across all of them is supply chains. Supply chains are really critical to be focused on, whether you're thinking about energy transitions and what are the critical minerals we'll be reliant on as changes are made. And what do those supply chains look like? Do we have diversity? Do we have strength? Or do we have single points of failure? The same thing when we're thinking about the bucket of chemical issues that I talked about. It's much broader. And for us to be successful in addressing these issues, we have to understand supply chains in a way that we just don't today. And then as we think about onshoring, permitting, environmental justice, again, these are critical elements in much broader supply chains. And if we don't keep an eye on how it all fits together, then we won't be making progress on these pressing issues. What we see, and what I think you'll hear others talk about today, is kind of the overall picture is this from a federal level. We very much are at a state of legislative paralysis because of such a closely divided House and Senate. Either could flip with very small changes, as well as a new administration that hasn't necessarily figured out how to drive meaningful legislative changes. We don't see a whole lot happening in the immediate future from a legislative standpoint, aside from reconciliation type of options that might be spending type of things. We don't see a whole lot happening when we think about energy and environmental regulatory or other new authorities that would need legislation to come forward. Existing regulatory frameworks, as a result, will be where I think we see the most action over the coming year, and even possibly for a couple years. So happy to dive more into that, but there's a lot of existing authorities that can be used to drive change, and certainly things that companies should be keeping an eye on. And the last thing that I'll flag, kind of in thinking about that big picture point of view, is conservative courts. Many may have forgotten, but over the last few years, Senator McConnell, as well as a number of others in the Republican Party, worked very hard to fill a tremendous number of court vacancies, as well as a significant shift at the Supreme Court. That will certainly inform what regulations are even proposed, which ones stand up, and what that sort of longer term landscape ends up looking like. So those are kind of the big picture things that we see as themes in this space. And I'll circle back to kind of my key things as I'm thinking about advocacy, thinking about how to respond to the different policy and regulatory challenges that will come up in these different spaces. And that really is the lesson of calm that Kitty teaches me, the lesson of sharing stories and actually stepping up to advocate that Dave has taught me. And then the lesson of Lisa, which is it can't just be about numbers, it has to be about people. And when we can connect with people's humanity, we have an opportunity sometimes to move an audience in a way that most people never would have imagined possible. The last thing I'll leave you with is so much of the conversation today is certainly going to focus on climate, is a perspective that my grandma Kitty shared. She's the one who's a big Trump fan. She's almost 100 years old. And, you know, some might think that someone like her is just going to be a red meat conservative. And in some ways she is. But she's also a person who spends a lot of time in her garden and she sees what's happening in the world around her. She reads the newspaper and sees changes that are happening. And just the other day, Kitty asked me, what's this believing in climate change stuff? Believing is about things you can't see. We can see that the climate is changing. I love Kitty and her perspective and her willingness to learn new things. I'd be happy to take your questions, and thanks for having me today. Hi, George.
Hello, Rachel. I don't know if there are any questions. I don't think there are any, but I do want to thank you for your comments and your insight. I want to thank you for sharing the lessons learned from your 3 recent encounters. And I want to thank you and all your colleagues at NAM for the support that you provide manufacturers across the country. So I'll remember these 3: calm, tell your story, and connect. And I will tell you that I'm a lot better at 2 of them than I am at the 3rd. So thanks, Rachel, for joining us today.
Absolutely. And I'll put my email in the chat if anyone ever wants to connect on some of these issues, has questions. Always an open door. I know I can be hard to track down, but my favorite thing in my job is getting to hear from people and understand what are the challenges you're facing on the ground on a day-to-day basis. And so I'm looking forward to hearing more of the discussions later today. Happy, like I said, to connect with anyone. And thanks again for letting me get to join you today.
Great, thanks again. Before we move to our next session, I'd like to ask that you first please participate in a quick poll of the keynote presentation. We value your feedback and it's important in improving our programming. So thanks so much for your input. You should have the poll on your screen right now. All right, thank you. We'll now hear an update on renewable natural gas with Craig Westerbeek, Senior Director, Smithfield Renewables and Hog Production Division, Environmental Affairs, Smithfield Foods, Inc., and Ryan Childress, Director, Gas Partnership Business Development, Gas Infrastructure Group, Dominion Energy. And moderating the session will be Erica Young, Director of Business Development, Gas Pipelines, NextEra Energy Resources. Erica?
Erica is experiencing some technical difficulties. I believe, Ryan, would you be able to get it started? Or Craig?
Sure, happy to.
Yeah. Go ahead, Craig.
Sound check. Can everybody hear me? I don't know how you get feedback on that, but hopefully you can. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak at the Energy Summit again this year and kind of bring everybody up to date with what's going on with renewable natural gas, both here in North Carolina and across the country. So kind of going to start the session. We've been introduced, Ryan. I think the first question is, what are the benefits of renewable natural gas?
Sure thing.
And, maybe you can tell everybody what they are.
Sure, happy. And thanks everybody for joining us today and giving us the opportunity. So, we talk about RNG, and it really has, what we call a triple win. It reduces methane emissions, which is, an incredibly potent greenhouse gas. Methane's about 25 times more potent from a global warming standpoint as CO2. So capturing it's really good for the environment. The second point we like to talk about when we talk about the benefits of RNG or that provides customers with a renewable negative carbon source of energy. As we all know, and we heard in the keynote, pretty much across the spectrum politically, business-wise, individually, folks are really focused on addressing climate change and trying to find ways to reduce our carbon footprint and work to net zero. And RNG is an important part of that puzzle. RNG is interchangeable with fossil gas, with traditional natural gas. So we have an outstanding infrastructure system on the natural gas side, and RNG actually can serve to reduce the overall carbon footprint of the natural gas pipeline system reliably. And it's also for customers, it's a great complement to intermittent sources of low carbon energy like solar and wind. I would point out, you saw what happened, in the winter down in Texas, where there were some tremendously challenging energy issues there on the supply side. Well, natural gas has got to be part of the solution going forward, and RNG is a great way to reduce the carbon intensity of the pipeline system as we work towards net zero. And the third thing, I'll mention something, but I think Craig maybe even can put some more color around this, given his work at Smithfield, especially with their partner family farmers in North Carolina and across the country. Is RNG provides farmers an ability to participate in the clean energy economy. They're able to capture the methane the operations produce when they're feeding America, and actually get income for that product and provide energy to their communities and to Americans. And so, when you look at those three pieces, the carbon reduction it provides, the clean energy source it provides customers, and the economic development it provides farmers and the communities they live in, I think we could all agree that RNG is a real positive thing for the environment, for our communities, and for the country as a whole. Craig, would you add anything around maybe the farmer piece of that puzzle?
Yeah, Ryan, I can, and maybe we'll kind of move into kind of the next question or topic that we were asked about, and that's how does renewable natural gas work? And in that process, I'll kind of talk about how it works for the farmer as well, Ryan. And so, how does RNG work? RNG, renewable natural gas, is just natural gas from a renewable source, and there's a lot of different opportunities to produce RNG. Basically, you can do it from any biomass, including manure, landfills, what have you. When those biological materials break down in an anaerobic environment, they produce a biomethane that's generally between 60 and 70% methane, that biogas is. And so in the process, you have to take that 60 to 70% methane product and create pipeline grade renewable natural gas so it can be used by customers. And so in North Carolina, and I'll use that as an example with regards to the efforts of Align and working with farmers, it's no secret that there's a lot of swine farms in eastern North Carolina. There's a density there that really allows for these type of projects, because there is economy of scale related to the cleaning of this gas and injecting the gas into the pipeline. North Carolina is a bit unique compared to other states. We've done these projects, and Align has done projects in Utah, and we're starting a project in Arizona, also in California as we speak. Smithfield also has projects in northern Missouri that have been going on for some time producing RNG. Typically, those farms, those sites are large farms that are owned by Smithfield, and we own the farms, we own the property, et cetera. Eastern North Carolina is a bit different in that Eastern North Carolina has hundreds of farms, and the majority of those farms, almost 90% of them, are owned by independent farmers who choose to grow animals for Smithfield or some other company. And so that presents a bit of a challenge to the process in that the farms are scattered across the countryside with different ownership. And so, we have chosen a route that we think is the best, in which we offer farmers the opportunity to invest in a digester for their site, ambient temperature mixed digester, and we provide them with a long-term offtake contract for the biogas they produce, not the RNG at this point, but the biogas. And so Align's business strategy really is to make investments in the infrastructure necessary to allow farmers to sell their biogas into a market. And so from an Align standpoint, those investments include interconnect, obviously, into the natural gas pipeline system. They include a gas upgrading system. In many cases, that's a pressure swing absorption system. It could be a membrane-based system. But in any event, those are pretty expensive items. And then also in the infrastructure to connect farms together to make those clusters, if you will, of farms act like a bigger unit, if you will, for farmers that choose to participate. So, for the farmer himself, that return on investment is a good return on investment. The ag lending groups are very excited about lending money to farmers for this particular venture, and it provides them with a good return on investment. I can tell you that so far, all the farmers that we have presented the business option to have been very excited about it and want to participate. We're just now starting to get some contracts signed with farmers as we develop our first project here in Warsaw, North Carolina. But kind of getting back to the original Turkey, North Carolina, getting back to the original question, how does renewable natural gas work? It's basically capturing biogas is produced as a product of anaerobic digestion that today is actually emitted legally as a fugitive emission, capturing that, processing it, cleaning it into a form of renewable natural gas that can be used in the grid. So very excited about what's going on here in North Carolina. We've started work again on our first project here in North Carolina. I failed to mention we're doing another project in Southeast Virginia. And so together with through Align, and that's going fairly well as well. So the next question, Ryan, really was, how does the gas get into the distribution system? So we make this gas at the gas upgrading system. How does it actually get into the distribution system?
Yeah, thanks, Craig. It's really two ways, and you mentioned one of them being, the actual interconnect that goes into the pipeline system. That's as proximal as you can be to the farms that choose to enter into the system and sell their gas to Align and have us condition it for them. So that's just like you would see when two pipelines come together, either on the interstate network or at a local distribution level. The companies you're familiar with in North Carolina are Piedmont Natural Gas and Dominion Energy North Carolina, formula PNC, and so PSNC, excuse me. And so, if there are farms close to there, you can either directly connect to those through small gauge, low pressure pipeline, and then compress it up to the pressure that needs to be to move it into the larger system. Or you can truck it. You can actually compress the gas down and truck it to an injection point. And what we'll look at doing both of those. Obviously, I would point to your Northern Missouri operations. You've shown that you can successfully do that both ways, and that allows you to most efficiently and effectively get the renewable natural gas into the pipeline where customers can use it.
Yeah,
Brian and Craig,
right.
I appreciate you guys jump starting us and getting
Okay, there you go, Erica.
So we resolved the technology issues. So good morning, everybody.
All right, good.
With the NextEra in development on the gas pipeline side, and we're partners in MVP Southgate. So again, appreciate the opportunity to work with you guys on this panel. Just a follow-up question on the technology. You know, and this is for Craig. You know, it appears that there are multiple biogas system technologies in use globally. From a very high level, can you explain the technology that Align RNG is using versus some of the others that are being used and deployed in other areas of the country?
Sure. So with our first project here, one thing I would tell you is we're a bit technology agnostic with regards to the gas cleaning part of this, which is kind of the core technology related to converting biogas into renewable natural gas. Having said that, here in North Carolina, the facility is being constructed as a pressure swing absorption system, actually made by Guild, and it's a very robust system that there's a lot of those installations. I think it's very predictable. It's actually being used at a project that's been producing gas in North Carolina called Optima KV for the last 3 years. We have one of those systems out in Missouri that's done well. So we like those systems. They're also membrane-based systems.
Mm-hmm.
We have quite a few of those in Missouri. It's actually what we have with the line project in Utah. It's what we plan to put in Virginia, and likely we'll have some here in North Carolina as well. Also a very robust system. You know, the membrane system probably came along a little bit later, so you know, trying to perfect that process is taking a little longer, but it's clearly commercially ready. There's other technologies as well. With regards to digester technology, we're fans of ambient temperature mixed digesters. There's a lot of different digester designs out there. I think for us, we really look at something that allows a farmer to manage that system every day. So sometimes you have to employ the keep it simple, stupid approach, and that's what we've really done with digestion. But to be honest, I think what we're seeing is we're getting very good volatile solids destruction rates, good biogas production rates from those. They're very robust. They you know, anytime you look at heated digesters, and there's a lot of those out there that I'm sure perform extremely well, they take a lot more management, number one. And then they're more prone to potential upset or bypass where the bugs just don't support the digestion due to whatever. And so, you know, we have kind of tended to really embrace technologies that are more robust, that are more forgiving and more predictable, to be quite honest.
Thank you for that. Appreciate it. So Ryan, the next question is for you. We understand that numerous natural gas local distribution companies, or LDCs, have filed tariffs for RNG sales across the country. Are you surprised at this evolution, and what can we expect next?
That's a great question, Erica. Thanks. You know, what I would say on that front is, you know, number one, I'm not surprised. Craig and I talk about this a lot. I mean, this industry reminds me a lot of the solar industry, say 5 or 10 years ago, right? I mean, that was, you know, you started to see solar tariffs, you started to see, you know, on the electric side of the energy business, you know, a big focus by utilities and distribution companies to find, frankly, low carbon renewable products for their customers. You know, we've changed, and I'm sure you see, you know, you all know this very well at NextEra, you know, the importance of focusing on the customer. And so what you're starting to see here, I think from you know, across the board on the utility side is how do we develop products that customers want to buy, whether that's C&I customers, commercial, industrial, you know, colleges, universities, or right down to residential users. And on the gas side, what we're starting to see is RNG tariffs make a lot of sense. I can say, you know, speak to 2 of our LDCs, one in Utah. There's a pilot program that's going on now. Our Dominion Energy West assets, the local distribution company that serves a lot of Utah. It's called the Green Therm Tariff. And what it basically does, it allows customers to voluntarily buy blocks of RNG to offset their carbon footprint. And there's a surcharge for that, so they pay a little bit of a premium, but we've seen strong demand, you know, over the first 18 months of that program. And then what Dominion is able to do then is, you know, on the customer's behalf, we sort of buy the environmental attributes, you know, in the markets, whether it's the transportation markets or other markets that allow us to supplement that, so the cost is sort of socialize for them, and they're able to achieve the goal they have of lowering their carbon footprint. And I just think you'll see that increase. Frankly, I think every day, whether it's on the energy companies' earnings calls, all the way from large oil majors like BP and Royal Dutch Shell, and even down to more state-focused utilities like we are at Dominion Energy. You hear executives talking about these products, and on both the electric and the gas side. I did see one question come in that I think I can address here that's helpful. Is it's talking about the grid, and not to get too technical, but the grid does have to rotate, and that's something that people talk a lot about. I believe Tim asked that question. So what I would say is, that's one important part of thinking about natural gas and rotating assets on the grid. Excuse me. We can't run the grid completely on inversion right now, on an inverter system, which would be solar. As you see more solar come on. So that's another, great thing about this. And we're actually seeing a lot of demand from electric utilities that want to source gas for their combined cycle plants, right? They can take it to their most efficient plant and then, create renewable energy credits, direct market, and other things. So kind of to wrap it up, Erica, what I would say is I think we're still in the early stages of the RNG industry, especially as it relates to regulation and regulated utilities. But I certainly view that that's going to increase, and that these sort of green tariffs, you'll start seeing them become much more common across America.
So Ryan, you've touched a little bit on some of the pieces of the pie that help to really commercialize this offering, and it is evolving. It's in early stages. Can you talk a little bit more about kind of what you see out there in terms of other pieces of the pie, parties that need to really come together to bring forward kind of full solution that includes RNG?
Yeah, I mean, my short answer on that, Erica, is a great question. Is any user of natural gas. There are lots of companies out there that use a thermal load, which is methane, natural gas, to create the things we use every day. I mean, it's hard to look around your home and not see something that's made by plastic or something that has natural gas as an input. And so we're seeing that come along. We're seeing customers learn more about this. I think even President Biden has pointed out in some of his comments during the campaign and now since he's been in office, and Secretary Regan is very familiar with with RNG, particularly North Carolina. And so it truly is a bridge to getting to net zero. And so I think just as customers learn more about this, it's incumbent upon us to educate folks, to let them know how this works, how the math works with methane capture and methane reduction, and how that does support lowering our carbon footprint, across industries.
Thank you. So this is a question for both of you, Ryan and Craig. Any lessons learned to share with biofuel sources to take the next step in developing RNG?
These projects aren't easy. I'll tell you that, one of the foundational things with regards to manure to energy projects is that there has to be a very strong relationship with the farms that are participating. And in my opinion, they have to be bought in or investors in the process. Because fundamentally, at the core of this, the management of the farm day to day, manure getting to a digester in a fresh form so it can be digested is critical. It's foundational to success of the project. And so, what we did very early on is we said, we need to find opportunities for farmers to invest and have a good return on investment, and have a business model that really allows them to participate in the process. And through that participation, we feel like we're going to get a lot better results long term. That's one thing as I look at many projects that are being proposed and the many that have come across my desk over the years, when the farmer's not an integral part of the investment and the return and the process, I think you're going to have major problems making the project work. And so that would be one I'd point out that, there's obviously other challenges to these projects and to this process. But that would be the major one I would point out.
Ryan,
Yeah, I think
anything to add to that?
Yeah, sure, Eric. I think one thing I would add is just, really, really looking at the science and the math. I mean, these projects are really good for the environment. When you look at a sort of what I call a bang for your buck on a carbon reduction from a carbon reduction standpoint, it's very, very hard to find anything else in the market that reduces as much CO2 equivalent as these projects. And so, to me, what that means is if we're serious about looking at all options to work to a net zero future on the energy side of things and from an environmental side of things, we've got to have RNG as a tool in the toolbox. There's no silver bullet to fix these issues. And I think just when you look at the math and the science, and I think it's important for us all to have these types of conversations and have an open dialogue. But as Craig and I often say, the math and the science are indisputable when you look at what these projects do from a carbon reduction standpoint. I think that's a really important point, that if folks take anything away from what I've talked about, certainly I would want you to know that these are good for the environment, and the math and the science really backs that up.
And I would even go further, beyond the carbon benefits. I think it's very important to understand that these projects take the emissions that today are occurring and are fugitive, at the farm level, and they capture those emissions, and then they, treat those, and the renewable natural gas, the methane portion, is actually sold into the grid to customers. But the other part is treated as well. I mean, a large portion of the biogas that's not methane is actually CO2, which that CO2 is released. But other things, whether it's through iron sponges or the cleaning technologies or combustion at the end, through a flare or through high heat thermal process and oxidation, then they're treated. So there are other benefits as well beyond the carbon reduction benefits from a farm perspective as well.
Thank you. And I just want to follow up on one comment you made earlier, Craig. You mentioned kind of aggregating the clusters of farms to help bring into the digesters and into the pipe systems. How do you find the interaction with the clusters? Is there typically one particular farmer that kind of acts on behalf of others? Or are you really interfacing with all of the different farmers in the clusters at the same time?
Well, one thing you see in Eastern North Carolina is farm sizes vary pretty greatly. So, you can have smaller farms, you can have larger farms, but within these clusters, you see all the above, and so you have to deal with all of them individually. Once again, when we approach farmers, we don't approach farmers from the standpoint, oh, you've got to do this. We offer them an opportunity to participate. We offer them a good return on investment, and it's completely voluntary whether they participate or not. And you really have to, tailor your message and have that conversation on a farm by farm basis, because like with any business, every farm is different with regards to its economics and what their long-term goals are. But so far, we've been very pleased that the farmers that we've approached thus far have been very receptive. Their banks are very receptive. They see this as a good opportunity to develop another revenue stream for them. And so, that's all going really well, but there's really only one way to do it. And it's hit the pavement and really bring that business opportunity to folks and let them decide whether or not it makes sense for them or not.
Good. So I wanted to see if we have any questions coming in from our audience. Janelle, can you check to see if we have any questions? If not, we can cover a couple others that we have.
Sure, we do have a few questions. There's one question, let's see, from Tim that is posed to Ryan. He says he spends far too much time with engineers and the folks at EPIC, NC State, and Clemson. And as a result, as a non-engineer, he understands the concept of inertia and why we need spinning assets. How do we educate the general public about something so critical as inertia and why it's a significant science-based obstacle to high amounts of wind, solar, and batteries?
Yeah, thanks, Janelle. That's a good question. I tried to hit it there before. And for full disclosure, I'm not an engineer. Craig is, so I might just have to ask him. But the basic point here is, the grid, the whole backbone of our electric transmission and distribution system is built on spinning assets. So there has to be the way, and I'm saying this at a high level because I'll get deep water quick, but without having, you know, that inertia, that spinning activity on the grid, you just get brownouts. You get things that like happened in Texas. The electricity can't move. It can't be distributed and pushed through the transformation process without sort of having, you know, spinning turbines that create the electricity and then through the step down process. So really, I think what Tim's getting at there is, you know, that's not talked about a lot. You know, I think the idea that we could just all of a sudden go to 100% solar, 100% wind, or some combination. The real bottom line there, I would say, is, you know, the wind doesn't blow all the time, and it's dark for half of the time too. So you've got to have other things. Obviously, batteries are very important. We're looking very diligently, as a company at battery storage, but the technology is not there yet. So, I kind of go back to something I said earlier, and you gotta have all the tools in your toolbox that you can use to reduce carbon, since that's the focus. And RNG is a great way to do that. You know, you'll I don't know if anybody's talking about that in this panel today or later panels, but hydrogen is another thing you're starting to hear a whole lot about, to substitute in the pipeline system. But RNG is ready now. That we've talked a little bit about how we need to scale it and some of the things we can do. And so, if you're serious about reducing carbon, RNG is a great complement, because it allows those spinning assets to continue to be used as we bridge going forward, because otherwise you start to have reliability issues. And, we saw that very acutely in Texas over the winter, which is not a place anybody wants to be.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Janelle, any other questions coming in from the audience?
I have another question. This question is from Brandon. I think it probably connects with the question from Tim. Well, similar to Ryan's answer. It's for Craig or Ryan. It says, at what price per MMBTU do you expect to sell RNG into the market?
So I think Ryan talked about this earlier. There's various markets out there. I think generally speaking, you do get the commodity gas value, obviously. Then beyond that, cellulosic biomass, manure being one of those, you can create a D3 RIN, and those RIN values are traded. That's part of the renewable fuel standard, and those RINs are traded every day. You can kind of look and see what those values are in that market. And then on top of that, you have the significant carbon reduction benefit, or the carbon attributes associated with that can be sold in various markets. I think the best way to answer that question is, you've got spot markets for those that will fluctuate. You've got longer term offtakes that can be negotiated with end users. Clearly, there's a premium to the natural gas commodity value of natural gas, but that can vary depending on how you determine is your best marketing strategy.
I have one question, Janelle, before we go back to an audience question. Over the next 5 years, what are the key hurdles that you think we need to overcome to increase supply of RNG? And I'll pose that to Ryan.
Yeah, I sort of think about two buckets of, and I think of them as opportunities. And the first is, we talked a lot about this, it's education and it's policy. And so, once you let people know, and there have been a couple of questions that talked about this, the importance of, how our current energy supply system works, and, the focus on carbon reduction, and then the carbon reduction opportunity that RNG provides, that seems to make a lot of sense, right? I mean, I think that's one of the reasons you're seeing so much more momentum and so much more conversation around RNG, so much more investment in it, over the past, even 6 months. It's been incredible to see how much more it's been talked about. And that's directly related to people becoming educated on, wow, this is a great product. This is a great asset that reduces a great amount of carbon and still works with the existing infrastructure system, which is crucially important. And then policy is important. I mean, Craig talked about it. It's not easy to do these projects, right? Mm-hmm. There's lots of permits involved. There are lots of stakeholders that you've got to communicate with, which is important, and we're happy to do that. But the policy environment needs to be in place such that I think carbon reduction is valued. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is, we've seen a lot of support, and rightly so, for incentives around solar and wind. Well, this is also a renewable resource that our policymakers, as they learn more about, want to support. And I think that's something that certainly Smithfield and Dominion together through a line are trying to lead the conversation on, because we think it's important that renewable natural gas be acknowledged for the value it provides in the new energy economy.
One statistic that I saw, Eric, if I can,
Sure.
recently was that North Carolina has, if you looked at the opportunity to produce renewable natural gas, North Carolina would be the number 3 state in the country, which I think is pretty impressive when you think about it. I mean, North Carolina doesn't have a significant amount of fossil fuel resources, and has never been a matter of fact. I think the first natural gas that was produced in North Carolina that was put into the natural gas grid was actually a manure to natural gas based project here in Kenansville, North Carolina, about 3 years ago. And so when you think about the opportunity in North Carolina for renewable natural gas, I think it's important to consider that there are a lot of biomass sources out there that can be used to produce renewable natural gas, and North Carolina is kind of at the top of the pyramid with regards to opportunity.
Very good. Janelle, I'll just do one more check to see if we have just one more question to come in from the audience. Okay, great.
Thanks, Erica.
Sure.
Okay, this question is posed from Kit. Is this gas caustic? How is it cleaned before getting into the pipeline system? I've seen farms doing this on closed loop systems to run generators, and they were down because the caustic nature had ruined their pipes.
So Kit's correct. I think historically, many of the manure to energy systems as being promoted by EPA and others kind of relied on taking this biogas that does have some corrosive values if not cleaned, and putting it through internal combustion engines or microturbines, spinning those to make electrons, either for the farm or for sale onto the grid. And so there's installations there. Align owns two generators here in North Carolina that are producing power today from biogas, unrefined biogas, so not clean biogas. So those projects can work and do work. Smithfield also is a partner in a large project of that nature out in Utah, independent of our Align project. But when you think about renewable natural gas, one of the requirements of the process is that you clean the gas to natural gas line specifications, and those tariffs are typically pretty significant. I think when you look at renewable natural gas from manure specifically, though, and you compare it to pipeline natural gas, I think one thing you do have to do is you do have to remove some level of hydrogen sulfide from the gas prior to injection, that eventually being oxidized through a thermal oxidizer at the end of the process. And we're talking about fairly small amounts of H2S, typically anywhere from 500 to 1500 ppm, but it does have to be dealt with just from a pipeline tariff standpoint. Kind of beyond that, there can be nothing in the gas that's not in the feedstock originally. And so what you see with manure-based natural gas or manure-based biogas is it's a pretty clean product. What's in that gas, there might be a list of 5 constituents, some nitrogen compounds, once again H2S, both in very small amounts, some moisture, but then CO2 and methane. And so when you look at natural gas that's in a natural gas pipeline, you have a lot of what I call enes and anes, a lot of petroleum-based products that are in that. You don't have that in renewable natural gas. So particularly from manure-based projects, you may from landfill-based projects. And so it actually is a very clean, high BTU gas once you get it clean. But to Kit's question, yes, you have to filter out or use these gas cleaning technologies to clean the impurities out of the gas.
Well,
Yeah.
Ryan and Craig. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm just going to add one thing. I mean, I think it's a important thing to emphasize. And, from a natural gas industry standpoint, this process is much simpler than the traditional midstream space where you're taking gas from, say, the Permian Basin or the Marcellus or the Utica Basin. To Craig's point, you've got a lot of different constituents in the gas that comes from fractionation or from fossil gas. Really, to Craig's point, I mean, you've got some very small amounts of trace, H2S and nitrogen, but it's really, to dumb it down for the non-engineers, it's basically a, roughly 60-40 CH4, which is methane, and CO2, which is carbon dioxide. It's a pretty simple compound, frankly.
Ryan and Craig, just want to say thank you for providing this update. This has been extremely informative. We are definitely pulling for your continued success with Align RNG. And again, just appreciate your time and sharing information. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you all for your expertise that you shared with us. It's Craig, Ryan, it's good to see you again. I appreciate your difficult work. I know it's not easy overcoming technology and policy and regulatory hurdles all at the same time, but your work is certainly beneficial, and keep up the good jobs. Erica, thank you for overcoming the technology issues, and your perseverance certainly enriched the program, and I'm glad to meet you. I see that your Texas A&M degree is prominently displayed behind you. I'm an Aggie by marriage, Gigamags. Thank you all very much. Before we head into our first break, please take this quick poll to gauge everyone's interest on this session. It should be popped up right now. All right, I think that's enough time there. Thank you very much for your input. All right, so now we're going to go into our first networking break. We'd like you to visit the networking lounges so you can virtually connect one-on-one with attendees, and that's in your people section. We'll continue our virtual program at 10 a.m. So we're running a little bit ahead of schedule, but we've got about 20 minutes. So try to do your best to be back a little bit before 10. We hope you'll enjoy the networking session, and at 10 o'clock, Devin McDonald will welcome you back. Please enjoy.
Hello, everyone. Mic check. Can folks hear me? Not that I could see whether you could or not, but welcome back from the networking break, everybody. And thank you for tuning back in. So I'm going to kick off our next session with my colleagues, Heather and Daniel. Our session today is aptly named Climate and Policy, and that is exactly what we're going to be talking about. So let me start by kind of giving an overview of APCO Worldwide, if you guys will humor me for a few minutes, and then I'm going to introduce my colleagues, and then I'm going to be quiet. So APCO Worldwide is a global communications, consulting, and business advisory firm. So we do everything from a crisis response to consumer-based campaigns to supporting with cross-cultural and cross-governmental relations and negotiations and everything in between. And we also have more than 30 global offices worldwide. And we have 3 of them represented here today. So I am Devin McDonald. I am a director at APCO Worldwide's Raleigh office. I focus on energy and public affairs. So for my work in North Carolina, it's a lot of infrastructure support focused on legislative and regulatory outcomes and the public affairs campaigns that support them, as well as community relations and stakeholder engagement. So for my part today, figured I would let the rest of today's esteemed panelists talk about infrastructure and the North Carolina policy environment, as they are much smarter on those issues than me. But I did want to bring in two of my favorite colleagues at APCO because in my work in North Carolina on energy issues, I find myself calling Daniel and Heather quite a bit. And so wanted to bring that expertise into the firm. So let me start by introducing folks. I'll start with Daniel, since you're on video there. Daniel is based in our Washington, DC office and is a member of our policy team. So he provides policy analysis and advising on myriad issues as it relates to US and international climate policy, US-Russia relations, and connecting dots anywhere we need them, from local, state, and federal governments all the way to different international bodies. Prior to joining APCO, Daniel started his career as an attorney on a US Fulbright scholarship to Albania, where he led trainings on the rule of law to improve the functioning of the Albanian court system. So 10 points to Daniel if he can figure out a way to work that in as a connection to the North Carolina energy landscape. And then also with us today is Heather McGeary. She recently just joined APCO to lead our global climate and sustainability practice, and we are thrilled to have her. So she has more than 20 years of experience working on climate change, a topic that may or may not have changed in the past 20 years. Heather will have to check us on that, but working to create successful projects and partnerships across the public and private sectors on climate change, but also social innovation and social justice. She just joined us from her previous role as Chief Operating Officer of the We Mean Business Coalition, that you may have heard of, a global nonprofit focused on driving some of the world's biggest and most influential companies towards net zero by 2040. So we are very fortunate to have them both here today. Thank you guys for joining us. We are gonna let Daniel start talking through from a federal perspective. What are we seeing out of the administration? What are we seeing out of Congress? Any things that we can learn from Carrie's discussions on climate and how that might impact the energy sector at large and potentially here in North Carolina, and then toss it over to Heather to kind of talk about ESG and how companies can put together a strong and robust climate policy. And then we're going to ask questions of you and want questions back. And I'm certain I will have some maybe trying to connect the dots between what you guys are talking about and what we're dealing here in North Carolina. So with that, Daniel, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Devin. I'm not going to fully try to connect the Albanian rule of law to the climate change discussion, but there are connections, of course, as we all see these major problems of equity and justice throughout the world are a major factor in the plans of the administration with climate. But I'm sure we're all here, if we're interested in the energy sector, we know a little bit about the complexities of the current federal government's plans with climate. So I'm going to not go into too much detail because there's just so many moving parts of the climate discussion today. But overall, we have a very interesting policy landscape and political landscape today, where you have Democrats with slight controls of both the House and the Senate, as well as the presidency, where you see President Biden really launching an ambitious and aggressive policy. These plans are very pro-technology investment. They're looking for major initiatives throughout the whole of government approach. And they're really selling all of their climate initiatives as jobs creators, which is, of course, a bit debatable in the policy landscape because of some challenges with labor seeing the jobs not paying quite as well. And also, Biden's been using this as the selling point to get us, as the United States, into a position of global leadership again. Because really at its heart, climate is an international issue that touches every single person throughout their state, local, and federal governments. One important caveat with the political landscape, though, is that the president just doesn't have all that much power to enact many of his policies at the domestic level. But the way that he is trying to do this is through the executive branch, So you have, of course, President Biden, who's driving all of this and announcing the major tax and spend policies that could get us to these major climate initiatives that he has proposed. You have his core climate team of his White House climate advisor, which is Gina McCarthy. You also have John Kerry, who is this climate envoy. And he's actually the first person to sit on the NSC, which is the major national security council that is solely focused on climate. Important to North Carolinians is the EPA head, Michael Reagan. And we've also seen all the cabinet secretaries through proposed executive orders where he, as in Biden here, is pushing a whole of government approach. So because of this international issue, whole of government approach, we've seen that one of the starting points is that climate is just all important for Biden and his administration. Earlier in April, we saw the climate summit where he brought all the world leaders together, as well as many business leaders trying to position the US on the global stage again as a global leader on climate. You saw the launching of the International Climate Finance Plan, which is supposed to be a carry-on from the Obama administration with climate. And then you've seen the focused role of Kerry, where he's bringing his long-term government experience to help bring about the whole of government approach. And more specifically, you've seen him really engaging with financial institutions, major oil, and the international community trying to gain major climate commitments, plans from the whole community in order to reach these really ambitious pledges. The really ambitious pledges that we've seen is the National Determined Contribution, the NDC, from the Paris Agreement. And that's where he's shooting for 50 to 52% cuts based off of 2005 baseline levels by 2030. You've seen other fact sheets from the administration come out where they're shooting for a clean energy standard of 100% by 2035. And again, there's all this emphasis on clean energy is jobs. But of course, to meet all these big plans and priorities, there has to be funding, because the federal government is only limited by the congressional spending power of the purse or congressional authorization of spending. And so where we're going to see that really come in is in the Senate. The House is about a 4 to 5 seat majority for the Democrats, but with the way the historical power is held in Congress, where it's centered in the leadership, you'll see Pelosi be able to pass basically anything that the Democrats want in the House. So that really makes it much more important what's going on in the Senate. Today, North Carolina has the 2 senators who are both Republicans. So unfortunately at this point, they don't have a whole lot of negotiating power, because just like the House, the Senate is also very power is centered in the leadership. So Mitch McConnell is going to have a final say unless there's some major change in the Senate rules, which just isn't very likely at this point, because I'm sure you've all heard of this one guy from West Virginia, Joe Manchin. He's really expected to play spoiler for any really ambitious Democratic plans on climate issues. Other things that we're really seeing is that everybody's really thinking that with these majorities that you can just pass anything you want, but there are the arcane rules of the Senate, such as the filibuster, budget reconciliation, that will have to be navigated in order to pass major climate legislation. At this point in time, we could see movement on a number of elements that I'm going to cover just a little bit later, where there are some bipartisan elements of the climate discussion in Congress today. But I want to first go to this clean energy standard, which is really fundamental in the policy landscape to see if we can meet the NDC that Biden has announced, as well as a lot of the additional priorities and whole of government approach. And so What we've seen with the climate energy standard is this move to make all energy generation come from green energy sources, or depending on the legislation, it could be a technology neutral approach, which essentially means that you could continue to burn fossil fuels and use carbon capture technology in order to reduce that down to zero, which results in a better climate emissions standard that would still be met under these climate pledges. The leading one here that we've seen recently is through the Senate Finance Committee, all Democrats, but Senator Wyden did propose a clean energy tax incentive just for that same technology neutral approach. So where really are we with the federal policy conversation on climate legislation? So we know everybody is talking about traditional infrastructure versus climate infrastructure, human infrastructure, this massive infrastructure debate. Now we've seen, unlike the COVID-19 stimulus bill, the recovery bill, that there was just absolutely no bipartisan support. There's been a lot more willingness to negotiate. There's been a lot more openness. And this has actually been led by Joe Manchin's Republican colleague, Senator Capito, who's been leading the negotiations for the Republicans. And even just this morning or late last night, she did announce that they are willing to go higher before the Biden administration and Democratic members of Congress have even proposed their counteroffer to the initial Republican plan. So this is a very positive sign that there will be some movement on the infrastructure bill, and that there is probably likely going to be some sort of climate addition to that. The other place that is, I think, particularly interesting for North Carolina is the bipartisan elements of the agriculture bills. You had Senators Mike Braun from Indiana, as well as Debbie Stabenow from Michigan, who reintroduced the Glowing Climate Solutions Act, which is a major push to help agriculture become more climate friendly. And I think that's a very positive direction for the climate legislation area. The really ambitious parts of climate, though, is likely going to remain in the hands of Joe Manchin, who's going to provide that 50th vote for any budget reconciliation plans. And that's still where I see the climate section going of the infrastructure bill, because there's just, it's unlikely to be aggressive enough for your most progressive Democrats. So where I'm really looking now is to the year-end spending package and through the budget reconciliation for the year end in order to get these major clean energy standards or any aggressive climate policy pushed through. And so that's fall of this year is when the next big movement will happen, because right now we've just going to remain in this negotiating phase of back and forth, slowly moving throughout the remaining congressional session for this year. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Heather to talk about what this means for businesses.
Great. Thank you so much, Daniel. And Talisa, if I could just trouble you to put up the 2 slides that I sent, that would be wonderful. Thanks so much. So just to build a little bit on what Daniel was talking about in terms of all of the activity that's happening around climate. And there's so much that has been happening at the international level. And Daniel was mentioning the nationally determined contributions and 50% cuts, and how do we get to 30% by, 50% by 2030 and net zero by 2050. And there's lots of numbers flying around, and I think what we're all conscious of and needing to get to is like, well, what does that mean for us? And what does that mean for our businesses and how we're going to operate? And I think there's one other piece that is really important to consider in addition to the kind of international policy, climate policy work that's happening is in the executive order that Biden has put out. There are quite a number of things that are much more focused on regulatory risk, that companies who are either publicly traded need to really pay attention to, or even if you're privately held and you're looking to sell or to have an IPO, it's also something to focus on, because any buyer, or if you're going to then become a regulated entity, it's something that you want to really have some focus on in the ESG space, and climate risk disclosure. And I think that's really what is quite important right now. So you may have done some reading. The Fed Financial Stability Oversight Council has to put out a report on climate risk disclosure in the next few months. And that is chaired by Janet Yellen. And so while the president doesn't actually have influence over Janet Yellen, he has to, she still has to address climate risk as part of this council, which is going to be interesting. And that could potentially have, economy-wide effects. And I won't go through all of these, but essentially what you can start to see is that through regulating pension funds, what's able to be discussed at annual meetings, what the rules are. Suppliers have to disclose greenhouse gas emissions. All of these types of things start to then create an environment where we have to be much more conscious of our greenhouse gas emissions and reporting and climate risk disclosure. And then I'll also say that even ahead of the regulatory environment, I think there's increasing pressure from investors themselves, like somehow Larry Fink has become a household name in the last, 6 months to anyone who follows investments and BlackRock. And so we're really seeing the focus with BlackRock leading and many, many others coming behind. And now so many more funds and asset managers and asset owners saying that they're going to go through their portfolios and ask for more disclosure. And so what does that mean if you're publicly traded or have an eye to going public or being sold, as I was mentioning before? I think that what that means is starting to look at what are the things that we're being asked to do as business. And if you could go to the next slide, Teresa, that would be great. And for full disclosure, I have adapted this, or we've adapted this at APCO from something that is being put out by some of the investor groups and by the Climate Action 100 Net Zero Company benchmark. This is what this is adapted from. And essentially, it's what we can most likely expect. And a lot of companies are actually doing already, or companies are finding themselves on some stage of their journey. And the first piece of it is really just setting an ambition. So internally or externally, getting to a place where you're like, this is probably going to happen, and we're going to need to commit to net zero by 2050. And again, I won't drag you through all of these 8, and we can make this available to you if you're interested in looking at it later. And of course, happy to talk through it. But once you set an ambition, you've got to set targets and goals. So I think this is where you're starting to then say, okay, now I'm hearing I've got to be 50% by 2030 if I'm going to commit to 100% by 2050. And then I think in the United States, there's this other piece, particularly if you're in the power sector or touch the power sector, that is, and there's talk of the 2035 clean energy standard where we have to be 100%, which means that maybe I have to be more ambitious than 50% by 2030 if you're part of the utilities power sector generation, which I'm sure everyone has been giving quite a lot of thought and strategic thinking to. After that, decarbonization strategies, a lot of people work with different entities. Your own teams and staff are incredibly important in this work, figuring out how do we deliver on those targets and goals. And then from your own capital expenditure and investment perspective is what are we doing to invest in the future, making sure that this is, that we're going to align our future investment with getting to those goals, right? And that's something that's very important, that investors are asking that question quite a lot. And then the climate policy support is really interesting one, which is looking at what is your company, what is your business position on climate, and then looking across your trade associations and aligning those. And a lot of times what we have found is that the individual companies tend to be more ambitious than the trade associations, and how can we work and harmonize across that. And then governance, which is just overall in the ESG bucket, is becoming much more of a focus. Just transition, I think, is something that we're all working through. I think it becomes very local issue too, around energy security, reducing energy poverty across communities where we operate. And then of course, just reporting back and reporting publicly to shareholders, to the various MSCI and CDPs of the world, to mark progress, to ensure that we're actually doing this work. I would say also, in specifically, to just mention one other piece, which is the Science-Based Targets Initiative does have sector guidance where companies are committing to a science-based target. And if you do it now, or if you've done it in the last year, essentially it's saying we're going to be aligned with the Paris Agreement and 1.5 degrees. And then you have some public support of having set that ambition and targets and goals, and working through some sectoral guidance that's been most likely already created at this point, depending on your sector, to help walk through some of that work. And then of course, all of this is really quite well and good, but we don't have policy in place at a federal level around any of this, or even a state level around any of this, that just helps create just ease of use and consistency. So companies are still kind of putting these things together on their own to respond to activists, investor activists, and pending, coming regulatory environment, regulatory changes. And so it is a bit of a bespoke process still at this point, and we'll see what happens going forward. And I'll just stop there so we can save more time for questions and comments.
Thank you both. So we'll, folks, add your questions to the chat as needed, or in the Q&A function. I have several, so you guys will entertain a couple of those. So we started the day with George mentioning in his open remarks about the impact of what happened in Texas with the winter storm this year. And I think within the climate conversation, within the energy conversation, it does feel at times that we are tugged in what feel like different directions. So you've got the push for clean, the push for affordable, and the push for reliable, not all of which obviously happen at the same time or at the same rate. And so I'm curious, from both of your perspectives, what impact, if any, did Texas have on the climate conversation? Has that snap folks back to reality of like, we've got to make sure things work before we're chasing this conversation about energy sources or energy markets or anything like that? Or are we barreling ahead and feeling like we'll figure it out? I'm curious about the impact of Texas.
I could just jump in. I feel like I've been having more conversations where people are like, oh, that whole Texas thing. And then a lot of like, what is in that infrastructure bill exactly? Because I think that even though power and utility companies might be saying, we're committing to renewables, we're, retiring coal, we're going to put in clean natural gas to deal with intermittency, but that's amazing. But if there's no an upgraded transmission line that can help bring the power from one place to another, we lose tons of efficiency, and then we're back in those situations again. So I think that the infrastructure bill and that those upgrades are incredibly important to us moving into the future, into a low carbon, no carbon economy.
I'll just continue on with what Heather said there. I'm actually in Austin, Texas right now, and had a nice 78 hours of no power. So I feel personally affected by the the Texas outage, what we've seen here and at the federal level is that there's a very interesting messaging competition as expected in the intense political partisan divide, where a lot of the blame was on the clean energy not being ready, but at the same time, for Texas, it's just it's disconnected from the rest of the U.S. power grid, and what that really gets into is the ability of the federal government to regulate interstate power transmission. And one part of the bills that we're going to see with the clean energy standard with any infrastructure for climate is that there needs to be the interstate transmission, because these major clean power generation places need to have consistent power that comes from solar and wind, and then the long transmission lines, which all are complex regulatory process to both build, finance, and send across to where the power is needed. And of course, we all know about the challenges that renewables have from the need for storage. And so a big part of all of the climate policy to address the issues like Texas going forward is the need for the initial investment to build up the renewable sources as being viable and supporting the technology to make it cost effective.
Thank
And
you
then
both.
before you go on, just to build on that too, where I think it's really important also this whole system approach of upgrading our power system to become more reliant on renewables, and also just as we draw down more and more power and our consumption increases too. And then the other piece of electric vehicles, right? As we move into transitioning our passenger fleets to EVs, we have created some like an amazing battery storage is one thing that we get when we have more of us driving electric vehicles. But if we don't have a reliable grid, then we start to have also transportation problems. And so just the reliability of our grid system is going to become even more integrated into our transportation system over time. And so just to underscore how important reliability and transmission is.
I agree. And you may have teed up the next two sessions perfectly with that one. We have 1 minute here. So just a quick hit from you both. Curious, what do you think the next frontier in this climate conversation is? We talk about 2030, 2035. You know, what do we think is coming next? Do we focus on the justice conversation and dig into more tangible results? I'm curious, kind of your thoughts.
Well, this is more up Heather's lane, but I can tell you that we're going to continue to see the US questioned on the global scale as long as there's a constant shift between emphasis on climate and non-emphasis on climate. And I think that's why you're going to see the federal government really trying to, federal government through Biden administrations, try to make it impossible for future administrations to back away from climate goals. And so that's going to be heavy regulation and trying to modernize and electrify the federal government as much as he possibly can through executive order and through short-term discretionary spending.
Yeah, and I would just say, and I know I focus on this in my talk, it's just the regulatory environment is going to be a space that's super important to watch for across all sectors. And then I also just think that we're starting to understand more about climate and technology and how much also I think machine learning and satellites and big data are going to really actually help us do much better measurement and reporting, which I think will speed up a lot of our activity and progress.
Awesome. Well, thank you both, Heather and Daniel, for joining us today. Thank you to the Chamber for having us, and we'll drop our emails into the chat as well in case anyone has follow-up questions, but looking forward to the rest of the day. So thank you all.
Well, I'm not able to join by video. This is George. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you fine, George.
Great. Try this again. Is that any better?
Much better. We can see you.
Okay, great. So Devin, Daniel, and Heather, thank you for your comments. A lot of proposed policy changes. It will be interesting to adapt to these proposed changes. And we're looking at the next few years as there will be some tension, there will be some pressures, but I'm confident that we'll find a way to collaborate on the best way on these expectations. Attendees, it's now time for yet another poll. I think you've got the hang of it by now. It should be up on your screens. Please provide us some valuable feedback. All right, thanks so much. Our next speaker is Asaf Nagler, Senior Director of Government Relations with ABB, and he's going to give us the top notes and current trends on transportation electrification. It's great to have you, Asaf, and yeah, I think you've had a pretty good segue into your comments, so the floor is yours.
Great, thanks so much. All right. So hi, my name is Asaf Nagler. I'm with ABB, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the economic opportunity that e-mobility presents for the state of North Carolina. So in the spirit of the quick hit theme of this talk, here are my 3 punchy messages to hopefully that you all take away. First, EVs are coming, and the transition to electric transportation is unstoppable. 2, the e-mobility economic opportunity for the state is tremendous. And 3, there's much that North Carolina needs to do to bring those economic benefits to the state and to all North Carolinians. So with that, let's move on to the next slide. So I just want to give you a quick overview of ABB if you don't know us. We are an electrification and automation technology provider. This kind of gives you a sense of what we do, but I'll just highlight a few things. On the electrification side of things, we make the equipment that moves electricity all the way from the grid to your home. So as you drive around your neighborhood and you see those gizmos on the top of power poles, we make those all the way to the breaker box in your basement, in your home or your building. That's where we are. We are providing control systems for factories, power plants, oil and gas rigs, and cool tech to detect methane leaks for natural gas. On the motion side of things, we're the #1 maker of industrial electric motors. These are everywhere, you just don't see them. They are the main components that make refrigeration work, that circulate the air in your buildings, that move conveyor belts in factories, and that pump water and wastewater treatment plants. So these guys are everywhere and they do the work of the economy. And then robotics, we're the #2 maker of industrial robots globally. These put cars together, they palletize products, and more they work directly with people in a collaborative way. So that's ABB. Next slide, please. So we are 110,000 employees globally, but here in the US, 20,000 employees, and over 1,600 of them are here in North Carolina. North Carolina is a home to our corporate headquarters in Cary. Our corporate research center is on Centennial campus at NC State. And we've most recently invested $30 million at our facility in Mebane, where we make a number of electrification pieces of equipment. But you can see we're kind of all over the state. Pine Tops, Asheville, Hickory, Charlotte, we're a little bit everywhere. We're glad to call North Carolina home. So next slide, please. So what is e-mobility? I think it's important to always start at the top with what we're talking about. For ABB, e-mobility means electrifying all modes of transportation, not just one or the other. I'll talk about a few of them here. On the top right of this screen here, you have a picture of a public charging site. That's what most folks tend to think about. These are the things that touch individuals in their day-to-day lives. I'd note that where we're headed is that charging like this is going to be ubiquitous, but it is also not monolithic, meaning it's not just going to be like going to a gas station to fill up where it's a separate errand. It's actually just going to be an integrated part of your life. Chargers will be at travel plazas, grocery stores, shopping malls, parking garages, hotels, workplaces, you name it. That's where charging is already going in and where it will continue to grow. So it's just going to be a part of your daily routine that you're going to see a charger, you're going to gas up as you need, and it's going to be more like charging up your phone than it is gassing up your car. In the top center here, transit buses are also one of the fastest electrifying sectors right now. ABB alone has deployed about 40 megawatts of chargers for the transit space. The return on investment is real for these buses, which is why you're seeing them move so quickly, and they're electrifying faster than anyone. Top left, you see a Class 8 tractor. Those are also moving towards electrification as well. The one you see here is actually a Daimler e-Cascadia. Daimler has a home here in North Carolina, and those are ABB chargers as well. So we mean everything from vehicles to buses to trucks, but we also mean the water as well. So ferries are quickly electrifying along with the rest of the marine sector. This one right here is made of the mist up in Niagara Falls. But North Carolina also has a significant ferry network along the Outer Banks that NC DOT manages, and there are big opportunities there for electrifying those ferries as well. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about what the economic and market opportunity is for e-mobility and for North Carolina. I note at the top that the movement towards e-mobility, I think, is unstoppable at this point. Most major OEMs have announced plans to fully transition to electric transportation, whether it's light duty fleet or even these medium and heavy duty fleet operators as well. The good news is these will lead to investment. We're looking at a 30% per year-on-year growth for the next decade in vehicles and charging. That number is actually rather conservative. And on the ground here, we're seeing growth that is actually much higher than 30% year-on-year. I'd also note that the recent estimate from the energy investment needed to facilitate a transition to electrification is around 100 billion over the next 10 years. And so this means chargers, this means the electrical equipment that connects the grid, the charger to the grid. It means distribution grid upgrades that are going to be needed all the way up to generation that will need to be brought online in order to power the load growth that EVs are going to bring. And this estimate, again, assumes 20 million EVs by 2030, which also is a fairly conservative estimate. So the real economic opportunity for e-mobility is significant. And I'd also note that as a net positive for the state of North Carolina. So just to put things in a little bit of perspective, currently North Carolina's transportation sector is powered by oil. That oil is imported into the state on the order of 164 million barrels per year to power its vehicles, which is the equivalent to $12 billion per year that North Carolinians are sending out of state in order to procure fuel for their vehicles. With e-mobility, instead of sending that money out of state, you can actually spend the money in state on electricity generated here on the power grid that is also very localized. And so it's really, even just on its base, transitioning to electric transportation is going to be a net economic gain for the state because the money will be spent locally. So where is North Carolina on its transition and journey towards EVs? So North Carolina has actually made some really significant inroads in the past year. Actually, EV sales in North Carolina outpaced the national average at the end of last year. But that being said, North Carolina still lags behind on some key metrics when it comes to infrastructure investment and EV deployments. We are currently 27th in the country on EV deployment, which is behind neighboring states like Virginia and Georgia. and we are 37th in the nation in DC fast charging deployment. So, North Carolina has a long way to go, but we are seeing some positive movement as the market starts to come to the state. And I know there are a lot of folks in the state, including Duke and others, who are trying to invest in that infrastructure so that we can start to get those benefits to the state. Next slide, please. That being said, I think it's important to note that North Carolina's business community is investing heavily in e-mobility, which I think is really, really encouraging. And it's all up and down the supply chain. So it's vehicles, it's charging, and it's even critical materials and supply chain. So to give some examples here, both Volvo Group and Daimler are based here in North Carolina. Volvo Group's Global Mack division is based here in North Carolina. They have embraced the transition to electric, and one of their all-electric refuse trucks is currently on the road in Hickory, in state. Daimler is also moving towards electrification, as you saw earlier in that photograph of their e-Cascadia truck. So the medium and heavy duty sector is live and well here in North Carolina, and they are committed in making those investments and moving towards electrification. On the charging side, you have two big giants here as well, ABB, as you know here. We have manufactured more EV chargers than anyone else in the world, and we call North Carolina home. Our friendly competitor Siemens is also committed to electrifying transportation, and they are here in North Carolina. And then on the supply chain side, you have two major lithium companies based here in North Carolina, Albemarle and Piedmont, that really round out the full suite of the business side here. So, North Carolina business community is not waiting, and they are investing heavily, but there's still a lot more that we can do in order to ensure that the full economic benefits will be accrued to all. Next slide, please. So where are we in North Carolina? So we've talked about how we have some strong business and private sector building blocks, but the full economic benefits of electric won't be unleashed without enabling government policies. So far, the Cooper administration has taken some really important first steps in building that foundation to hopefully help us redirect that $12 billion of outflow to inflow in the state here. Committing to 80,000 EVs. They've done tremendous work bringing all the stakeholders together and creating a zero emission vehicle plan, converting the state fleet, and making great strides. You see the city of Charlotte has also recently launched a big pilot for converting its transit fleet to electric. So there is some good groundwork in the state, which is very encouraging, but there is a lot more that we can be doing. The transition to electric is going to be transformative. And so up and down the sector, there are things that we can do from a policy perspective. So macro policies are very important, but so are micro ones. So while we'd all like to see incentives for buying new vehicles and charging, that's not all there is to do. It's simple everyday things like making sure that folks who have non-electric cars don't park in front of a charger. This is called anti-icing legislation. Making sure that new buildings that are put in the ground are EV ready, meaning that they already have space in their breaker boxes. The cabling has already been done, so that when electric vehicles do become more ubiquitous, you don't then have to tear up the walls and blast through concrete to rewire the whole building. So EV ready building codes are a very straightforward thing that can be done today to help save money down the road. Local regions and municipalities can be converting their transit fleets and their ferry fleets to electric. I think something that it's important to note and why these transit fleets are converting is they're cheaper to operate over time because electricity is cheaper than diesel. They have fewer moving parts, so their maintenance costs are a lot less. And so there really are a lot of good reasons why they deliver long-term value to consumers and to the taxpayers. And that's why we're seeing local governments make a lot of those changes. And the other types of policies we can do are making sure that we spend VW settlement money on zero emissions. and also doing no harm. So, one thing that always we hear rear its head oftentimes are that EV owners don't pay their share to use the roads. And so a lot of folks are trying to assess fees on EVs. I think this is one of those penny wise, pound foolish policies. The gas tax solvency problem will not be, it's been around for a long time, and EVs are not the cause of it, and they're also not the solution for it. So we need to look at ways to actually encourage EVs. EV drivers actually pay sales tax when they charge up for their electricity, so they're not quite freeloaders. But we want to do what we can to encourage that economic growth, not discourage it. So with that, I'm just going to kind of summarize what the 3 takeaways are for everyone. The first is that EVs are coming, and North Carolina needs to decide whether it's going to be a leader in this space or whether it's going to kind of go along for the ride. The second is that the e-mobility economic opportunity is tremendous, 30% growth year on year over the next decade, and the opportunity to localize $12 billion that we're spending on oil. And the third is that there's much that the North Carolina policymakers can do to help enable that market to grow and ultimately bring those economic benefits and growth to the state. So with that, I will wrap. If there's time for questions, I'd be happy to answer it.
Janelle, any questions in the Q&A?
Hi, George. There's no questions in Q&A at this moment.
Asaf, thank you for your comments. Thanks for the presentation. I certainly learned a lot. You see Asaf's email address. If you have any questions, please direct them to him directly, or we can pass them along.
Great. Thanks so much, George.
Thank you. All right, so we're moving into our last panel discussion, but beforehand, we've got another poll for you to participate in, please. All right. As we move into our final panel discussion of today's summit, I'm sure everyone's interested to hear from experts on resilient infrastructure in North Carolina's evolving grid. We just heard about e-mobility. How in the world are we going to get all the electricity where we need it, when we need it? So I'm really interested in this panel as well. Please don't hold back on asking any of your questions, and certainly use the Q&A function, not the chat function. Joining us on this panel are Nelson Peeler, Senior Vice President of Transmission and Fuel Strategy and Policy at Duke Energy, Mark Halls, Director of Environment, Safety, and Product Compliance at SureTape Technologies, and Dr. Edmund Schweitzer, President and Chief Technology Officer at Schweitzer Engineering Laboratories. And we thank Dr. Rob Cox, Associate Director of Energy Production and Infrastructure Center at UNC Charlotte, for moderating this discussion. Dr. Cox, if you're on, please take it away.
All right, thank you very much, George. And one thing I'll add to those introductions that George provided, I noticed all 4 of our speakers here today are engineers. So I'll give you that, and have at least one engineering degree. So I'll give you that word of warning before we get started. I think it's going to be a great panel and a lot of good information to share that builds on some of the discussions we've had already today. So I'm going to go ahead and start this conversation with Nelson. So Nelson, although we have some of the most affordable and reliable power here in North Carolina, we're also living in a time of high population growth and changing consumer expectations, as we've heard already here today. Duke Energy recently identified a set of quote mega trends during their development of the grid improvement plan here in North Carolina. Can you kind of briefly describe what these mega trends are?
Yeah, certainly. So in order to support the change that we've really been talking about all morning, the transition to cleaner energy, different types of generating assets, and different expectations, there are a number of, as you described, mega trends that we've identified that are driving a need for the change in how the grid is constructed and operated. And you actually mentioned 2 of those in your question. So one being customer growth or load growth and how it's concentrated. So for example, it could be electrification in urban areas, could be load growth in certain areas that drive a need for investment and change in the grid. Certainly another is the changing expectations of customers. So customers want not only reliable and affordable electricity, but they want choices, options, and information on how their electricity is delivered to them. So we see those certainly as two of those trends. Other trends that we've identified that, again, driving a need for grid investment natural causes, weather events. I think there's a pretty good consensus around increasing significant weather events and intensity of those events. So particularly North Carolina, we're blessed with a wonderful state that has mountains, coast, and other areas, but it also gives us ice storms, hurricanes, and thunderstorms across the state. So that's another opportunity. As we've seen this week with, in the news, the threat of cyber attacks. So cyber and physical security implications for the grid are driving additional needs for investment. And then technology. So technology, both from the availability and affordability of more distributed types of technologies, whether that be solar, whether that be storage, whether that be electric vehicles, that's driving, again, changing investment and requirements for the grid, as well as advancing grid technologies, things like communications infrastructure, smarter technology for sensing and situational awareness and control. A lot of those things are being advanced, things like synchrophaser technology, advanced relays. I'm sure Dr. Schweitzer can tell us lots about that, but those technologies are driving the ability to operate the grid differently and address some of those things. And then the last one I'll mention is really environmental overall. So the desire for different sources of generation and energy and cleaner energy and the ability to produce that, reach that 2050 net zero carbon. So those sort of a summary, if you will, Dr. Cox, of what we see that's driving a need for investment in our grid here in North Carolina.
Great. That's a terrific overview. And of course, we started to hear about some of those things earlier today. I think one of the things that's beneficial about this panel is we've got a mix of folks. And so Mark, you're sort of the person here that can represent from the customer side. So can you speak a little bit about what's at stake for a large energy consumer like SureTape when affordable and reliable power is at risk?
Yeah, thank you. I was thinking about that as you were asking that question, and as a manufacturer, probably one of the most important things that we have is supply chain, right? So the biggest thing that we want to look at is that supply chain partnership. And when we've looked at that with Duke Energy, they've been a supply chain partner for us for a little over 100 years from our founding company. So we look at consistency in that supply chain, we look at reliability in that supply chain, and we're going to look at cost competitiveness in that supply chain. In that 100 years now, we're beginning to have this question now again about reliability. And when we talk about reliability, the important thing from us is from a quality standpoint, it's there and that we have the quality. So modern manufacturing environment, we're extremely concerned about, do we have the right frequency? Do we have the right voltages being delivered to the facilities? And it's not just now that our manufacturing environments have become much more automated. Our IT infrastructure is much more of a load demand for us as well. And all those things are extremely sensitive to any kind of a fluctuation in that. So those are the factors that we're looking for that make sure that we've got what we need to operate, that diverse portfolio of generating assets that are brought to bear for us, and then being able to deliver it to us reliably and consistently. So that's what's important to us.
Terrific. Okay. Well, I'm really pleased to have this entire group here today, but Dr. Schweitzer, an exchange here between the two professors on the panel. So Dr. Schweitzer, we've seen some of the issues that Nelson talked about and how those have impacted other parts of the country. So for instance, as we talked about earlier today in some of these conversations, we saw some significant power outages in Texas recently. And it would be helpful, I think, if you could describe, some of the root cause of the issues that occurred in Texas, and what are some of the aspects of the system we have here in North Carolina that makes it different and makes us potentially less likely to have some of those types of issues?
Well, thank you, Dr. Cox, and thanks to the North Carolina Chamber of Commerce for getting us together. Chambers of Commerce represent the spirit of free enterprise, and it's a real pleasure to be a part of this. So we're blessed to be part of an industry that moves energy at the speed of light. Nobody else gets to move their commodity like that. Flick of a switch, 186,000 miles a second. And as our ABB friend said, that EVs are coming, and some of the loads of the chargers are forecast to be on the order of 1/4 megawatt. So that's a pretty significant kind of a load that we have to be looking forward to. So in the case of Texas, I think the root cause of troubles there were re-regulation, and that stems back to the days, well, in the around 1990, where folks believed that instead of the electric power industry being organized by regional franchises in different parts of the country, each one of those franchises being responsible for generation, transmission, and distribution region by region, some Texas businessmen in a company that's no longer around said we've been doing it wrong for 100 years, that Edison and Insull got it wrong. Instead, there should be independent generating companies. The transmission company should really be seen as a grid, distribution companies, and finally retailers from then. So Texas did move in that direction. And in order then to do the planning that would happen, that does happen, say within Nelson Peeler's company of Duke Energy, instead of this happening G, T, and D all together in a regional franchise, once we broke the system up, sliced the loaf the other way, if you will, it got a lot harder to plan. There was no longer one single necktie to grab, and government needed to create something else to attempt to do that, and I believe that's how ERCOT was born. But they don't have any assets. They only have rules. So too many neckties. Here in North Carolina, we're blessed. Our electric bills say Duke Energy on the top, and that's a necktie. So this left us with a big gap of dependability. And in Texas, ERCOT calculated only a 3% worst case margin, and that's not enough. I think Texas, of course, experienced their kind of bad weather, and there was also a pretty heavy in-migration to the state, people leaving other states, and Texas just plain needs more generation than that. Here in North Carolina, generation, transmission, and distribution, once again, is all planned by the public service company that owns it. And a margin of 17% is much greater than the 3% fuzzy margin in Texas. So I'd like to see the regions of our country that move to this re-regulated form go back to the public service company that Duke so well represents in our country. And I think that's the key for the successful integration of wind, solar, the rebirth of nuclear at some point in the future. It will be correctly managed to charge electric cars, to make the environment cleaner, to support reliable service to manufacturers such as Sure Tape. That's what I believe is our future for reliability. Thank you, Dr. Cox.
All right, yeah, thanks, Dr. Schweitzer. A lot of great points that you made in there. I think about how the markets have changed. Mark, I want to look to you for a couple of follow-up questions. I think there were a couple of key points that Dr. Schweitzer made, and I think there were two of them in particular. And the first one deals with the market structure and the deregulated market versus the vertically integrated market that we have here in North Carolina. So as we were preparing for this session, you noted that the vertical integration here in North Carolina has been extremely valuable to you as a customer. Can you describe your experience, in this part of the country versus other parts of the country where that vertical integration doesn't happen, and what your experience has been like, and what the real differences are?
So I would begin to look at that in two different forms. One would be when we're taking a look at just costs. The simplicity of cost from the vertical integrated entity. I've got my cost for distribution, my cost for generation, everything's wrapped up in one, and I can see that very clearly and understand what is my true cost of delivery to my site. The second is in actual service. And I think that's an important key point. So when I have an issue with service, I'm able to make contact with my account rep, and I'm able to address anything from a transmission issue to a distribution issue. Dr. Schweitzer talked about the demand on the system. I'm able to talk to that account rep and understand, where are you at on a really high demand day? But then when we have an issue that can impact our delivery, I understand what lines have been affected and what that potential uptime is. In our facilities that operate in the deregulated states, and most recently impacted in one of our facilities in the Northeast, you've got multiple entities that you've got to try to contact and understand what does that uptime look like and who's that repair time come up. And when you begin to cross multiple entities that are just doing the distribution, and you've got multiple distribution legs that are out, it gets to be very frustrating is probably one of the best terms, but you're not able to determine what does an uptime look like for that facility. We've got customer demands to meet, and we have ship schedules to meet. We've got employees to try to help them understand what's going to happen with that facility. In a Duke Energy North Carolina look, most we've ever had, is from minutes to hours. Obviously, we've had extreme occasions where we've had a little bit longer downtime than that versus 4, 5, 6 days of downtime trying to come back up. So I know that's a little bit long answer to the question, but I hope that gives you a little bit of color from where our concerns would be.
I think that's helpful, especially as a large customer, to understand, sort of that customer service aspect that kind of falls into all of that. And I think the number of neckties to pull, I think, was the term that Dr. Schweitzer used. I guess you've only got one tie to pull in North Carolina. All right. Well, there was another question, a point that Dr. Schweitzer made in there, which I think is about this difference in what he called the dependability gap in Texas, and the fact that in North Carolina, Duke is able to guarantee a much greater capacity margin, that 17% capacity margin as opposed to that 3% capacity margin. Can you talk a little bit about how important that is? So I guess, and maybe the additional part of that is because of that, the likelihood of events like Texas is a little bit different here in North Carolina, right? We're a little bit less likely to have those kinds of events. So can you describe, I guess, from your perspective, how significant that is to you as a customer?
Let me try to frame this up a little bit. So I'm going to change it a little bit from the Texas model to the North Carolina traditional summer August day. It's 95 degrees, projected hit 98. And, everybody's kicking their AC on at 1 o'clock. Duke is scrambling to determine, how much of that 17% is really there or not. That's when you really enjoy them having that focus at 17 versus 3. Because when that system is beginning to trend out, then we don't have this once in a lifetime winter storm. We've got a normal southern, summer day where we've got a fixed set of assets trying to provide that increasing load demand. And that's also one of the questions that comes to it's very concerning for us is Duke is able to meet that now with the traditional set of assets that they have employed. And we want to make sure that as we look at future growth within the system and how they begin to, to deliver that electricity from multiple new generating assets, that they're able to meet that on those days as well. So, because the neat thing about when we have that phenomena is we have zero wind, except for that little blob of red transitioning across the weather map that you hope is getting ready to hit you, just because it'll cool things down.
Right.
So.
Right. Well said. Okay. All right. Well, so obviously, we're experiencing changes here in North Carolina, and I'd like to maybe go back to Nelson. So even though power is affordable and reliable here in North Carolina, we know that we'll need to address the threats stemming from the megatrends that you mentioned earlier. Can you give some examples of some of the grid strengthening measures that Duke is implementing right now, and how you thought about balancing the needs of different customer classes when you developed those proposals for those measures?
Yeah, certainly. And I'd also like to reinforce, Dr. Schweitzer's and Mark's comments about the diverse resource needs. It's the planning margin certainly is very important, but it's also important that what makes up that planning margin. I think Mark hit that very well with having a diverse resource mix as we transition from coal or other resources into more variable resources, that we make sure we do it in an effective and thoughtful manner. Right. So really good points by Mark. And from a grid strengthening standpoint, I call out just a couple of examples. One being structural improvements. So things like strengthening the actual physical infrastructure of transmission towers so that they can withstand, either more ice loading, heavier winds, stronger storms. That's a very important piece. And also with that, flood protection. So we're seeing flooding in areas we haven't seen in the past. And so those are two very important for the really focused on our higher voltage bulk power system that would, certainly see a direct reliability impact for Mark and his operation at a wholesale service level. And from a more of a, residential customer perspective, we also have similar grid hardening for our distribution system, but one specific program I'll mention is we have a targeted undergrounding program that for the right areas, it makes sense for some of that infrastructure to be, put underground and protected on a, really more of a case by case basis. So if you kind of look at the different customer segment there, one of those programs is directed really at reliability and affordability for a typical residential customer, the targeted undergrounding. And the bigger infrastructure upgrades and flood protection, while it does benefit every customer, it certainly helps at a reliability level for, those wholesale large customers that need that really high reliability. So when we implement those programs, design those programs, we certainly consider the rate impacts and benefit analysis there, and the enhanced reliability at a, hopefully a small incremental cost that is viewed as valuable to those customers.
Terrific. Okay. That's good to understand how that process works a little bit. I guess in hearing some of those comments, Mark, how important is it for you as a customer to know that Duke Energy is looking at developing affordable solutions that address these issues and make the grid more reliable and more resilient?
I think it's extremely important, for us, particular, very selfishly, as we look to grow, and where we want to make that investment. We want to make that investment in a location where we've got some certainty in what our energy costs are going to be and our energy availability that's going to be there and be there reliably. I spoke about a facility that we have in the Northeast. There's a significant difference in cost there. We have to plan differently for that facility because of potential energy needs that are impacted due to weather and climate type issues. So it's an extremely important thing that we look at. And I think that's something that we want to always give that that mindful eye about. I come back to reliability and consistency again. You know, those are the key pieces that go along with that cost competitiveness. You know, we don't want to be out of step with what's going on around us so that we can continue to enjoy, you know, the opportunities to grow and to support different things. So.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It sounds like it's not just cost, but it's that sort of consistency that is also really key.
It is. And the one thing that I would just add to that consistency piece is when you're watching that basketball game and it's the last second of the game and it's a 2-point game and you get that blip, that's what our PLCs see when we see that little voltage sag, when we see that little drop in frequency. And as mad as it makes you watching the basketball game, it makes it really tough to make a product and get it out the door during those situations. So.
Right. That's a great analogy, especially for our folks here in North Carolina. All right. Terrific. Well, Nelson, I'll look back to you here for a second. So I guess, as we've heard from Mark, the reliability, the affordability, and the customer service model that sort of exist here in North Carolina are extremely valuable to customers. Of course, that said, Duke is clearly committed to a cleaner resource mix, and that can certainly threaten reliability and affordability if it's not done right. How is Duke addressing that need for a cleaner energy mix while ensuring reliability and affordability that keep companies like SureTape here in North Carolina? How do we ensure that we keep that affordability and reliability while cleaning that resource mix?
Yeah, so great question. And I really go back to some of Mark's comments, and I'd use the word value for what we're looking for, right? It's not it's not a single dimensional thing. It's not just cost. It's not just reliability. It is value to customers for what we're providing. And, I also go back to some of Dr. Schweitzer's comments about an integrated planning process. So the way it will be achieved is, number one, by listening to customers and other stakeholders like Mark about what's important, having their input into that process, and then utilizing an effective integrated planning process that plans the grid from end to end, from generation to the actual delivery to the customer and the communication to the customer. And doing that effectively in North Carolina with, inclusion of the appropriate stakeholders who are affected and interested in that. So that's our objective. You could argue that maybe California and maybe Texas has, there's some challenge to their reliability because of the pace at which some things have been done or the manner in which it's been done. But we certainly believe that with an effective integrated planning process, we can move to, the cleaner, zero carbon energy and continue to provide the reliable and affordable service that we're talking about here today. We just have to do it, thoughtfully with the right inputs and the right consideration. So that's our approach. We do integrated resource plan in North Carolina. We offered a lot of options, in those plans that we put forward in the most recent one we filed. We had a lot of input from stakeholders, customers into, what they desire to see, and, strong focus on value, right? The value being cleaner energy, reliable energy, and affordable energy. So I'm very convinced we can solve this, this future problem, but we just have to be thoughtful at how we go about it.
Yeah, that's terrific. Yeah. So one of the comments I think, Dr. Schweitzer, that you made, and we were thinking about this session, was in talking about, and this actually gets to one of the questions I see there in the question box, about the need for or the top-notch engineers at Duke Energy and the work that they do and trusting the engineers and trusting the experts. Maybe you can give us a final thought on that, how that energy transition will play out to hit some of those things that Nelson just spoke about, Dr. Schweitzer.
Well, thank you. First of all, a lot of those engineers are coming from your institution, Dr. Cox, so that right. Lots of your graduates work for us as well as for our friends at Duke. And our facilities people buy short tape. Of course, we buy electricity from Duke. Duke buys our equipment. So we're all quite interrelated here, in addition to us enjoying the students that UNC produces. So there's years ago, somebody asked me what, it was a government sponsored thing, what percentage of penetration of solar can there be in a power system today? And I said, well, it could be 100% as long as you have 100% dependable sources as well. I don't know if that was much of an answer, but that's what we need. This dependability is such a key component of electric power. In 1915, excuse me, in 1915, Samuel Insull said, let us suppose by some calamity our service is instantaneously stopped. He was addressing students who had at the Chicago Central Station. He said, if it occurred at any time during the ordinary working day, it would stop the urban transportation lines of the city, it would stop the elevators, and it would absolutely stop the businesses of our big emporiums of retail commerce. So reliability, dependability have been key from the beginning. So when we start integrating these intermittent resources, one of the beautiful things of moving energy at the speed of light is when we combine intermittence through, in this case, Duke Energy's wires and transformers, that on aggregate, they become more dependable. That's a very, very important part of the value proposition that Nelson's company offers us all. Another thing that we're looking at, of course, is no longer are feeders just feeders, but they're also collectors of energy, and we have bilateral flows. So today the feeders are becoming more like bus bars, and these are big changes. So when we're making these, the things do have to be engineered correctly, and that's the value of the public service company model with the regional franchise, looking at GTD and the customer. And unfortunately, in markets such as Texas, the distance from that customer to the generators has become greater and diffuse. So I'm real optimistic about the future of electric power, and especially when it's in the hands of experts such as the teams at Duke Energy.
Well, great. I think that's a great point to end on. And I'm happy that you pointed out our students that are a key piece of that activity, both at Duke and at Schweitzer and many other places. Appreciate that. All right, so with that, I guess we can open up the floor to questions from our audience if they have anything that they would like to bring to our panelists. I know that I see one from Tim Fairchild that jumps in there.
I'm going ahead and I'll post a question from Tim. It's for Rob and the panelists. It says, how can those of us in the private sector encourage the best and brightest students to take up the challenge of achieving a clean, affordable, and reliable energy future?
So as a faculty member here, I know that there's a lot of things that we do here within UNC Charlotte, and Tim is a big piece of that. Tim is part of our executive advisory board. So that wasn't a plant, I don't think, in terms of the questions, but Tim and others like Thea Jamil at Duke Energy, Neil Wilmshurst at EPRI. There's a lot of great folks that are helping us, I think, from the private sector to think about how we prepare students for that future. And there's a lot of great activities here within EPIC at UNC Charlotte that focus on that. I know EPIC is working closely with Clemson and NC State in activities to focus on really building up students through industry projects. And I think that's one of the great ways to do it is industry sponsored projects, and being able to give them that kind of real world experience. I don't know if our industry folks there can maybe kind of chime in a little bit as well. I think there's some great comments that you guys might be able to share.
Well, if I may, with the industry projects comment, Dr. Cox, SEL operates a huge internship program, so that works hand in glove with young folks' education. And we challenge our interns to work on significant projects. I think they get a feel for what it is to be meeting modern needs inside the electric power industry. So it works hand in glove between the university and industry through co-op stints, internships, and we fostered a huge program of this around the country, around the world actually. And gosh, we've seen young people who aren't quite sure what they want to do, even at younger ages, maybe starting out in manufacturing, maybe right after high school or getting out of the military service. They join us and they want to they get intrigued by all these different opportunities and about making electric power safer, more reliable, and more economical. And they go for it. They start signing up for courses at University of Idaho, Washington State University, over in Montana, down there in Charlotte, Purdue University, and elsewhere, because they get a visceral feel for how important electric power is to humankind and all the opportunities there are to serve those needs in more modern and cleaner ways.
Yeah, I'll just briefly add that, I think the opportunity for students to get exposure to actual real industry issues, or whether it's through an internship or an undergraduate research project that's an industry sponsored, that's where people get an interest, and they realize that there's a lot more to the power industry. There's, high levels of technology, communications infrastructure, all kinds of very interesting engineering problems. So I think that exposure is the way to go. And, we certainly appreciate working with the universities, your UNCC included, and, get great value out of the interns that we get from there, many of whom turn into employees.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Great points. Yeah. No, we certainly enjoy working with everyone on that. I know we've worked closely with both Duke and Schweitzer over the years. All right. Do we have any other questions?
Okay. There are no other open questions, Dr. Cox.
All right. Terrific. Well, if there's no other questions, I'd like to thank our panelists. That it's been a great session. I know that I think it provides some great perspective, really on some of the challenges we're facing here in North Carolina, and how, from the customer perspective, we really able to address that here. So I'd like to thank everyone.
All right, I'm back with you. Fantastic information discussion. We appreciate you sharing your expertise. Personally, I find it enlightening to learn of the difference from a customer perspective of the regulatory construct and regulation in North Carolina versus other states. And I also think it will be beneficial, and it's encouraging to hear that there's going to be great value and willingness to work with shareholders from our utilities. So one final poll's getting ready to appear, and it's a two-parter. So please take time to answer both questions. Here's the first one. Oh, there's both of them. We do appreciate you staying engaged with us throughout the day and providing feedback via the polls. But your input is important, and we read all of the poll results and we take those into account. Also, we've included a direct way for you to provide written comments, any suggestions you might have, recommendations, and you can do that by clicking the event survey link at the bottom of this page. The link will also be included in a recap email you're going to receive in the next day or so. So before we conclude our summit, I want to express sincere gratitude on behalf of the North Carolina Chamber team to today's supporting organizations, industry experts, policymakers, our business community, and all of you in attendance for coming together as we continue to work to strengthen North Carolina's energy future. Also, as a reminder, the North Carolina Chamber is holding Women, a Force in Business Charlotte edition virtually on May 26th. Visit northcarolinachamber.com for more details about the conference and other upcoming events. Thank you for being with us today, but most importantly, be well and be safe. We do have a short video for you before we part, and we want to thank Governor Cooper and our legislative leaders for uniting in this vital message to North Carolinians. This is our best shot to save lives and livelihoods. Please feel free to share the link that's offered in the chat. I look forward to seeing you all again soon, and it might even be in person. Be well.
Okay. You know, it was important to get my shot because we need to do all we can to avoid the spread of this virus.
I took my shot because I wanted to make sure that I had done everything to protect myself, but also to protect the people that I came in contact with.
I want to protect myself, my family, my neighbors, my colleagues, and so I took it.
I'm most looking forward to hugs. I'm most looking forward to seeing my family members, my friends.
Hugging my daughters, going to a Carolina Hurricanes hockey game.
Getting out in the spring, getting outside, hopefully going to a baseball game.
There's a light at the end of the tunnel. We finally see a way that we're defeating it. The science says that this is the best way for us to get a handle on it.
It's such a small thing that folks can do to really help avoid the spread of this disease.
This is our best shot.
This is our best shot.
This is our best shot.
This is our absolute best shot
to beat COVID-19.